My name is Isabella Reyes. I am 25 years old, and I run the small Italian bakery my father built with his own hands on the corner of Delancey and Ninth. 3 weeks after his funeral, a man in a charcoal suit sat down across from me at my own kitchen table, uninvited, and told me my father had died, owing him more money than I would earn in this bakery in the next 20 years. His name was Vincent Castellano, a man I had called Uncle Vin my entire childhood, who sent me a card with cash inside every birthday since I was 6 years old, who sat in the front row at my father's funeral in a black coat, weeping like a brother. "Your father and I had an understanding," he said, folding his hands on my grandmother's lace tablecloth like he had every right to touch it. "A debt doesn't disappear just because a man does." "What debt?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Vincent smiled, the same warm smile he'd worn at every holiday dinner of my life. And for the first time, it looked nothing like warmth at all. "Your father borrowed against this bakery years ago to keep it standing. He never paid a cent of it back. But we made another arrangement, a long time ago, one that doesn't require cash at all." "What arrangement?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past me instead, toward the framed photo on the wall of my father, shaking his hand outside this very bakery the day it opened. Both of them young, both of them smiling like men who trusted each other completely. "You'll marry my son," Vincent said finally, as though he were reading me the weather. "Nicholas, that was always the agreement. Your father simply never found the right time to tell you." I sat there in my own kitchen, 25 years old, 3 weeks a fatherless woman, and understood that my entire future had apparently been decided before I was old enough to remember it happening. I should have asked him then what kind of business a man needed a wedding to settle instead of money. I should have asked why Nicholas, a man I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade, looked every single time I'd ever seen him at Castellano family gatherings, like someone flinching before a hand was even raised. I didn't ask any of it yet. What I did do, the moment Vincent's car pulled away from the curb outside my bakery, was call the one person who might actually tell me the truth about what my father had really owed, and to whom. I called Marco Del Vecchio, my father's oldest friend, and the only person left alive who had known him since they were both teenagers, washing dishes in the same restaurant kitchen 40 years ago. Marco had retired from bookkeeping years earlier, but he still kept an office 2 blocks from the bakery, more out of habit than necessity, a small room above a shoe repair shop that smelled like old paper and espresso. "Isabella," he said, when I told him what Vincent had said at my kitchen table. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired, the way people look when a thing they've been dreading finally arrives. "Sit down. There's history here your father never wanted you carrying." "Then carry it for me now," I said. "Please." Marco was quiet for a long moment, turning a coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Your father and Vincent grew up on the same street. Vincent's family had money even then. Real money, though nobody in the neighborhood ever asked too closely where it came from. When your father wanted to open this bakery, no bank would lend to a 23-year-old with nothing but flour and ambition. Vincent offered to help, so my father borrowed from him. That's it? That's the debt. The original loan, yes, that part was simple enough, and your father paid most of it back over the years, slower than he wanted, but honestly, what he could never pay back was something Vincent added later, once the bakery was doing well enough to be worth something. Vincent started routing certain deliveries through your father's supply orders, boxes that weren't flour." My stomach turned slowly cold. "What kind of boxes?" Marco met my eyes. "The kind that moved through a bakery's loading dock better than they'd move through anywhere a person might actually look twice. Your father didn't know, not at first. By the time he understood what he'd agreed to, refusing meant admitting he'd already been part of it for 2 years. Vincent made sure of that timing very deliberately. I thought of my father, of the man who taught me to laminate dough at 5 in the morning before school, who cried at every one of my birthdays, who never once, in 25 years, gave me any reason to imagine he was capable of the kind of fear Marco was describing. Why didn't he go to the police and admit what he'd been part of, even unknowingly, for years? Lose the bakery either way, maybe lose more than that. Vincent made it clear, without ever saying it outright, that walking away wasn't really an option anymore. So your father did what he always did. He found a way to survive it quietly, and he kept trying to pay down what he could in actual money, hoping eventually he'd owe nothing but debt. No more favors, no more boxes. And the marriage, the arrangement with Nicholas. Marco's face changed, softened in a way that frightened me more than his previous grimness had. That started years ago, too, when you and Nicholas were still children. I think in his own way, your father believed it might actually protect you. If you married into the family formally, Vincent would have no reason left to threaten the bakery, because by then it would belong, in Vincent's mind, to family. That's not protection, I said. That's selling me to make his fear go away. I know, Marco said quietly. I told him so, more than once. He never disagreed with me. He just never found the courage to undo it either. I left Marco's office with more questions than I'd walked in with, and one name circling my thoughts louder than any other. Nicholas Castellano, a man I hadn't spoken to properly since we were teenagers, who used to sit silently at the edge of every family gathering while his father held court at the head of the table, who I remembered mostly for the bruise I'd once seen on his jaw at 16 that everyone had quietly agreed not to mention. I found his number still saved in my old phone, unused in 8 years, and typed a message 3 times before I sent it. I need to talk to you. It's about our fathers. He called me within the hour, his voice cautious, guarded in a way that told me he already suspected exactly what I wanted to discuss. Not on the phone, he said. Meet me at the pier tomorrow morning, early, before my father's awake. He doesn't know I'm coming. I arrived at 6 the next morning. The water gray and quiet, gulls circling over empty fishing boats. Nicholas was already there, leaning against the railing, older than I remembered him, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He told you about the arrangement, Nicholas said, before I'd even said good morning. It wasn't a question. Did you know? I've known since I was 17. He told me the way you'd tell someone their schedule for the week. Marry Isabella Reyes when the time comes, secure the family's interest in the bakery. He never once asked if it was something I wanted. He never asked anyone that. Why didn't you ever say anything? Warn me, at least. Nicholas looked out at the water for a long moment before answering. Because every time I tried to push back against anything my father wanted, for 20 years, I learned exactly what happens to people who push back against Vincent Castellano. I didn't want that landing on you before it had to. What does happen, I asked, to people who push back? He rolled up his sleeve without a word and showed me a scar along his forearm, old, faded white against his skin, the kind of mark that had clearly healed wrong because nobody had taken him to get it properly treated. I was 19, he said quietly. I told him I didn't want any part of the business, that I wanted to study architecture instead. He didn't hit me himself. He had someone else do it, made sure I understood the lesson came from further up than just a slammed door. Architecture stopped being something I mentioned after that. I stood there on that pier, 25 years old, staring at a man I barely knew, and yet suddenly understood more completely than I understood almost anyone else in my life, because we had both spent our entire adulthood quietly surviving the same man's version of love. I'm not marrying you because he says I have to, I said finally, but I think we should figure out, together, exactly what he's done, to both our families, and whether there's a way to actually stop him. Nicholas turned to look at me properly for the first time since I'd arrived, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like hope, an emotion I suspected he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. There might be, he said slowly. There's a ledger. My father keeps it locked in his study. Real numbers, real names, everything Marco just told you about the deliveries, going back almost 15 years. I've seen the outside of it 100 times. I've just never had a reason brave enough to look inside. You do now, I said. He nodded once, and for the first time in longer than either of us could probably remember, neither of us looked away from what was coming next. Vincent called me himself 3 days after the pier, his voice warm in the way that used to comfort me as a child and now made my skin crawl. Isabella, Cara, I want to host a dinner this Sunday, Announce the engagement properly to the whole family. Your father would have wanted a proper celebration, not this quiet arrangement hanging unspoken over everyone. That's very soon, I said carefully, my heart hammering. Grief doesn't need to delay happiness forever, Vincent said. Besides, there are people I'd like reassured that the Reyes family's obligations remain exactly where they belong. I understood immediately what he meant. This wasn't about celebration. It was about visibility, about making the arrangement public, and therefore impossible to quietly unravel later. Once an entire family gathering witnessed the engagement, backing out would become a much louder, much more dangerous conversation. I called Nicholas the moment I hung up, my hands unsteady. He wants to announce it Sunday, in front of everyone. There was a long silence on the line. Then we have less time than we thought, Nicholas finally said. If it's public, it becomes something he can point to as proof to the other families, too. Look, even my own son agreed. See how easily an arrangement resolves when people understand their place. Can we stall it? Not without raising exactly the suspicion we can't afford yet. I think we say yes to Sunday. We smile. We let him have his dinner, and underneath it, we move faster on the ledger than we planned. Sunday arrived colder than the calendar suggested it should be. The Castellano dining room filled with relatives I barely recognized, candles lit along a table set for 20. Vincent at its head looking more satisfied than I had seen him look since my father's funeral. He raised his glass early in the evening, before the appetizers had even been cleared. "To family," he said, his eyes finding mine across the table with an expression that dared me to look away first. "To promises finally kept, the way they were always meant to be." I raised my glass along with everyone else, Nicholas's hand finding mine beneath the tablecloth, steady, deliberate, a small anchor neither of us acknowledged aloud. I smiled the way I had learned, over 25 years, to smile at every uncomfortable moment of my life, and underneath that smile, for the first time, I felt something closer to purpose than fear. Because I already knew, sitting at that table drinking to a promise I never intended to keep, that in less than 72 hours, Nicholas would have his father's study key in hand, and whatever Vincent believed he had secured that night would already be quietly, irreversibly coming apart. We didn't go looking for the ledger that same week. Nicholas said his father checked the study every night before bed, a ritual so precise Nicholas could set a clock by it, which meant any attempt to get inside would need patience we didn't quite have, but couldn't afford to rush either. Instead, we started smaller. Nicholas began paying closer attention to conversations he'd spent years learning to tune out. Dinners where Vincent discussed deliveries and arrangements in a code so casual it had clearly been normalized inside that house for decades. I went back to Marco, asking him to write down everything he remembered, every year, every amount, every name he could recall from when my father first started confiding in him. "Your father kept his own records too," Marco told me during our second meeting, sliding a small leather notebook across his desk, worn soft at the corners. He gave this to me for safekeeping about 4 years ago, right after his heart trouble started. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to you, but only if you asked the right questions first. I think he was hoping you never would have to. I opened the notebook with hands that weren't quite steady. My father's handwriting filled every page, dates, dollar amounts, brief notes in a private shorthand only he would have fully understood. But near the back, in ink that looked newer than the rest, was an entry that stopped my breath entirely. March 14th. Told V, no more deliveries through the shop. Says Isabella's arrangement covers what's owed instead. Told him no. He says the arrangement was never mine to cancel. The entry was dated 6 months before my father died. He tried to stop it, I said quietly, right before the end. He tried to say no. Marco nodded slowly. Your father's heart attack came 4 months after that entry. I've never let myself think too hard about the timing. I sat with that thought long after I left his office, walking home through streets I'd known my entire life, looking at them differently now, wondering how many of the men who nodded politely at me outside the bakery every morning knew exactly what my father had spent years quietly protecting me from. Nicholas called that night, his voice low, careful, the tone of someone speaking from somewhere he didn't want overheard. My father's flying to Miami Thursday, some meeting he's had scheduled for months. He'll be gone 2 full days. That's our only real window before the wedding pressure starts again. Then we do it Thursday, I said. The 2 days felt impossibly long and impossibly short at once. Nicholas let himself into the study using a spare key he'd copied years earlier and never used. Some quiet act of rebellion he'd apparently kept in reserve his entire adult life without knowing why. The ledger was exactly where he remembered, locked in a drawer with a key hidden in a place so obvious, in a book of poetry Vincent clearly never actually read, that I understood immediately how little Vincent had ever feared his own son looking too closely. The ledger confirmed everything Marco had told me, and considerably more. 15 years of deliveries routed through small family businesses across 3 neighborhoods. Not just my father's bakery, a pattern that made it clear my father had never been uniquely chosen for this arrangement, only one name among many men too afraid or too indebted to refuse. But near the middle of the ledger, in a section labeled simply Arrangements, was a list of names entirely different from the delivery records, family names, dates, and beside each one, a single word, secured. My father's name appeared there too, beside my own, dated the year I turned 16. He was planning this before either of us were old enough to understand what it meant, Nicholas said quietly, reading over my shoulder. For all of these families, not just yours. How many? I asked. I count 11, Nicholas said. 11 families he's had some kind of leverage over for years, through debt, through fear, through exactly what he did to my father, to yours. I photographed every page of that ledger with shaking hands, careful not to disturb a single paper, aware that whatever we did next would need proof that couldn't simply be dismissed as a daughter's grief or a son's resentment. This isn't something we can bring to the police alone, I said. Not without protection, not without someone who already understands exactly how deep this goes. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment. There's someone, a detective named Renata Alvarez. She investigated my father twice over the years. Both times the cases fell apart because witnesses stopped cooperating right before trial. She never stopped believing there was something real underneath it. I overheard my father complain about her more than once, always with more fear in his voice than he ever showed about anyone else. Do you trust her? I trust that she spent years trying to do exactly what we're trying to do now. I think that matters more than trust, honestly. I think it means she won't quit. We met Detective Alvarez 3 days later, in a diner 2 towns over, far enough from Vincent's usual paths that neither of us worried about being recognized. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, listening to our entire account without interrupting once, occasionally jotting a note in a small pad she kept beside her coffee. I need to be honest with you both, she said when we finished. I've built partial cases against Vincent Castellano twice before, and both times, key witnesses recanted right before it mattered, usually after receiving what I can only describe as a very persuasive visit. If you're going to help me build a real case this time, you need to understand the risk doesn't disappear once you hand me a ledger. It follows you until this is actually finished. What do you need from us? I asked. Everything you already have for a start. But more than that, I need Nicholas willing to testify to what he's witnessed personally, not just what's written on paper. Ledgers get explained away in court. A son describing exactly what happened to his own arm at 19. And why is much harder for a jury to dismiss. Nicholas didn't hesitate, which surprised me more than it probably should have. I'll testify. I've spent 8 years pretending that scar came from a work accident. I'm done protecting a story that was never true in the first place. Alvarez studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we start building this properly. Quietly, carefully, and only when we're ready. Because if Vincent suspects anything, before we have enough to hold him, both of you become considerably less safe than you are right now. Alvarez laid out a plan over the following weeks that felt nothing like the dramatic raids I'd half expected from movies. It was slower, quieter, built almost entirely on patience. She wanted corroboration from other families in the ledger before moving on anything. aware that a case built solely on the word of Vincent's own son and a dead man's private notebook would collapse exactly the way her previous attempts had. "People are afraid to talk," she told us during one of our increasingly frequent meetings at the diner. "But fear has a shelf life, especially once someone believes they're not the only one finally willing to speak." I started with the names I recognized from the bakery's old supplier lists. Families I'd grown up seeing at church, at street festivals, men who nodded politely at my father for 20 years, without either of us ever discussing what that politeness had actually cost him. I approached them carefully, never mentioning Alvarez directly at first, only asking quiet questions about my father, about old debts, about whether anyone else had ever felt the particular fear I now understood completely. 2 families shut their doors on me immediately, unwilling to say a single word. But the third, an elderly baker named Salvatore Greco, who had known my father since they were boys, invited me in without hesitation, sat me down at his kitchen table, and wept before I'd even finished my first sentence. "I have waited 11 years for someone to ask me that question," he said. "I thought it would be your father. I didn't expect it to be you." Salvatore's records, kept in a shoebox he'd hidden for over a decade, matched Vincent's ledger almost exactly, confirming amounts, dates, the same coded language for deliveries that weren't flour. More importantly, he agreed to speak with Alvarez directly, the first witness in years willing to put his name to any of it. Word moves quietly but persistently through a neighborhood built on decades of shared history, and within a month, 2 more families came forward on their own, having heard, through channels none of us could fully trace, that someone was finally willing to listen, and that this time the effort had real protection behind it. Midway through that month, Vincent nearly caught us. He stopped by the bakery unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, something he almost never did, and found Nicholas behind the counter with flour on his hands and a stack of Salvatore's old invoices tucked just beneath the register, close enough that a single wrong glance could have ended everything we'd built. "Learning the family trade early," Vincent said, smiling at his son in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. A husband should understand his wife's business." "Someone has to keep the ovens running," Nicholas said, his voice perfectly even, though I saw his hand tighten slightly against the counter's edge. Vincent's gaze drifted toward the register, toward the small gap where the invoices sat hidden, and for one unbearable second I was certain he could see straight through the wood. "Isabella," he said instead, turning to me, "Sunday's dinner pleased me greatly. I trust the wedding planning is moving along." "Slowly," I said, forcing a smile I'd practiced too many times that month. "There's a lot to arrange." "There always is," Vincent agreed, and left as suddenly as he'd arrived, the bell above the door ringing behind him. Neither of us spoke until his car pulled away from the curb. Nicholas exhaled slowly, sliding the invoices deeper beneath the register. "We need to move faster," he said, "before luck like that runs out." Nicholas, meanwhile, carried a weight I watched settle differently on him each week. The particular exhaustion of a man preparing to testify against his own father. He met with Alvarez alone several times, going over the details of his childhood with a precision that clearly cost him more than he ever said aloud. "He's going to know it was me," Nicholas said one evening, sitting across from me in my apartment above the bakery, the same space where my father used to fall asleep some nights reading invoices at 2 a.m. "The moment this becomes real, he'll know exactly who let it happen." "You didn't let anything happen," I said. "You survived something for 8 years that should never have happened to you at all." "This isn't betrayal, Nicholas. This is the first honest thing either of us has done since we were teenagers." He looked at me for a long moment, something unguarded passing behind his eyes that I hadn't seen from him before, not once, in all our years of quiet, distant family gatherings. "I used to hate you a little," he admitted. "Not really you. The idea of you. The arrangement made you feel like a sentence I was serving, something decided for me before I had any say. I'm sorry I let myself think of you that way, even for a moment." "I understand it," I said. "I think, if I'm honest, some part of me resented you too, before I actually knew you. It's strange, realizing the person you were taught to see as your cage was suffering under the exact same hand." Something shifted quietly between us in the weeks that followed. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, built entirely on the strange intimacy of two people surviving the same danger together. We spent long evenings going through documents, building timelines, sitting in comfortable silence when the weight of it all became too much for words. I found myself looking forward to his knock at my door in a way that had nothing to do with Vincent, or the ledger, or the case slowly building against him. By early autumn, Alvarez had what she needed: 7 families willing to testify, Salvatore's shoebox of records, my father's notebook, the photographed ledger, and Nicholas's own account of years of quiet violence disguised as discipline. "We're ready," she told us, on a gray October morning, in the same diner where this had all started. "I'm bringing this to the district attorney this week. Once we move, Vincent will be arrested within days. I need you both to understand what that means. Reporters, neighbors with opinions, a trial that will likely take months. This isn't going to end quietly, no matter how quietly we built it." "I'm ready," Nicholas said without hesitation. I looked at him, at the man who 8 months earlier had been almost a stranger to me, bound by nothing but a debt neither of us had chosen, and felt something entirely unexpected settle firmly in my chest. "So am I," I said. Vincent Castellano was arrested on a Tuesday morning in late October, led out of his own home in handcuffs while neighbors watched from behind curtains they'd spent years too afraid to pull fully open. He did not resist, did not speak, only looked toward the upstairs window where Nicholas stood watching, his expression unreadable even from that distance. The trial that followed took 4 months, exactly as Alvarez had warned. Months of testimony from 7 families, from Salvatore Greco's trembling voice describing 11 years of silence, from Nicholas describing a scar on his arm and the man who had ordered it, from me reading my father's final entry aloud in a courtroom so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat between every word. "Told V, no more deliveries through the shop. He says the arrangement was never mine to cancel." Vincent was convicted on multiple counts of extortion, racketeering, and conspiracy, sentenced to 18 years, a number that felt, on the day it was read aloud, both enormous and somehow insufficient for everything he had taken from so many families over so many years. Nicholas stood beside me on the courthouse steps that afternoon, neither of us quite able to process what had just happened. Both of us, finally, genuinely free of a man who had shaped both our lives without our consent, since before either of us was old enough to understand what freedom even meant. "I don't know what happens now," he admitted quietly. "For either of us. I don't know who I am without spending every day afraid of him." "I don't either," I said, "but I'd like to find out, with you if you want that too." He looked at me for a long moment, the October wind moving between us, and for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled without a single trace of caution behind it. "I think," he said, "I'd like that more than anything I've ever actually chosen for myself." Winter arrived quietly that year, the first winter in either of our lives that didn't carry the weight of Vincent Castellano's shadow somewhere underneath it. The bakery stayed open through it all, through the arrest, through the trial, through every reporter who stood outside asking questions I refused to answer on the record. My father's regulars kept coming, quietly protective in the way small neighborhoods sometimes are, bringing flowers, leaving notes, telling me stories about him I'd never heard before, each one another piece of the man I was only now understanding completely. Nicholas moved out of his father's house the week of the arrest, into a small apartment 2 blocks from the bakery, close enough that he started appearing most mornings before opening, quietly learning to laminate dough exactly the way my father had once taught me, his hands clumsy at first, patient by the 3rd week, genuinely skilled by the 2nd month. "You don't have to keep doing this," I told him one morning, watching him fold butter into dough with more concentration than the task strictly required. "I know," he said, not looking up. "I want to. I spent my whole life being told what my hands were for. I like discovering they're actually good at something that isn't hurting anyone." We didn't rush anything, not at first. There was too much healing required, individually, before either of us could reasonably ask more of each other than friendship. I started therapy that winter, finally naming out loud everything I'd spent 25 years absorbing quietly, the fear disguised as family loyalty, the debt disguised as love. Nicholas did the same, working slowly through 8 years of damage that had nothing to do with architecture school and everything to do with the learning, for the first time, that his own wants were allowed to matter. Marco came by the bakery often that winter, watching us both with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to see something set right. "Your father would have liked this," he told me once, nodding toward Nicholas, who was carefully boxing pastries for a delivery neither of us needed protection to make any more. "Not the arrangement. This, whatever this actually turns into." "What do you think it's turning into?" I asked. Marco just smiled and didn't answer, the way he always did when he already knew something I hadn't quite let myself admit yet. It was Nicholas who said it first, on a night in early spring, almost a year after Vincent's arrest, sitting on the back steps of the bakery with flour still dusted across his forearms. "I used to think love was something owed, something extracted the way my father extracted everything else. I don't feel that anymore, not with you. I just feel like I finally understand what it's supposed to be, and I didn't expect that understanding to come from the one person I was forced to imagine spending my life with." "Are you proposing?" I asked, half laughing, half not. "Not yet," he said. I wanted to say it properly first, without any of it being about debts or arrangements or anything either of our fathers decided for us. "I love you, Isabella. Not because anyone told me to, because I chose to, every single day since October, and I'd like to keep choosing it, if you'll let me." I married Nicholas Castellano the following autumn in the small garden behind the bakery, exactly 1 year. After his father's conviction, surrounded by Salvatore Greco and 6 of the other families who had finally spoken their truth, by Marco standing where my father should have stood, by Detective Alvarez, who came in her one good dress and cried more than anyone expected her to. We didn't call it revenge, what happened to Vincent, and we don't call our marriage a resolution either. Not really. It was simply what remained once the fear was gone. 2 people who found each other underneath an arrangement neither of us chose, who chose each other honestly once nothing forced our hands anymore. The bakery still smells like my father's bread every morning, and some mornings kneading dough beside my husband, in the same kitchen where a man in a charcoal suit once told me my whole future had already been decided without me. I think about how wrong he was. Nothing about my life was ever his to decide. It only took losing everything to understand that clearly enough to finally take it back.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.